Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello everybody, welcome back to Keen on America. Today we are in New York City, talking to one of the world's leading authorities on inequality, Branko Milanovic. And as always on Keen on America, I began with Branko by asking him when and where he was born.
Well, I'm Branko Milanovic. I work at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. I'm teaching here, I'm a research professor, and I was born in 1953.
When did you first, Branko, come to the United States?
Well, I came first, well, that was 78, I believe. Actually, I came here. I studied here in Florida for a while. Then I went back to Belgrade, where I did my dissertation, because I already had started the dissertation. Although this is not all chronologically correct, because then I was also in the World Bank in 1983.
Your career is very distinguished as an economist, and your expertise is on economic inequality. You're one of the world's leading authorities on that. When you first came to the United States as a graduate student, what was your opinion of America as a place that maybe captured the spirit of equality? Many Europeans have come here, of course, and imagined it as the laboratory of equality, particularly de Tocqueville. Did you think of America as a place which was more equal than others, to borrow some language from Orwell?
Not really, actually. When I came to the United States, and you have to take into account generational issues here, I liked the American way of life, generally speaking, and of course I was somewhat privileged. You know, students are always privileged to some extent, but I did not have this sort of Tocquevillian dream of America as a land of equality of opportunity. And I think partly because of the very strong influence of the Vietnam War. I think that war on my generation, or people who were interested in foreign policy, international relations, painted the US under the very sort of in dark colors, and that was of course the worst case, because there were other things, you know, like Dominican Republic, afterwards Nicaragua, you know, Lumumba, then Indonesia with Suharto. So I really thought more in those terms of foreign policy.
But did you come, in a sense, to this country, maybe not consciously, to renew yourself, to reinvent yourself, to regenerate yourself, this place of plasticity where everything is possible, coming from old Europe?
Could be, but really, to be quite honest, I don't think that actually I came with lots of stuff in my life was a result of accidents and chance, and I did not. The reason why I came is actually the institute in Belgrade, where I got my first job, had an exchange program with Florida, and they would actually have students sent for graduates, for masters actually, and believe it or not, it was difficult to find people in Belgrade in those days who would come to the United States, and there were two women who were originally supposed to come, and neither of them wanted to come because of personal reasons. So you had from Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, a large diaspora and many people who went as Gastarbeiters to Germany, Austria, Sweden, and so on, but relatively few skilled people went, especially did not go to study abroad. You know, it was not, you wouldn't get anything out of studying abroad.
It's almost 50 years since you first came to Florida.
Yeah.
Do you think of yourself now as an American?
I do, actually. My children are American, you know, and yes, I don't basically think every day what am I, but yes, I've lived so long. One day I remember that a woman at customs, actually, she asked me more or less the question that you asked me, and then she was shocked when I said the number of years. She said, well, that's more than I've been alive.
Do you think, coming from a place that no longer exists, at least in its formal political context, Yugoslavia, it made it easier to become an American?
Not really, because that war was the war of Yugoslav dissolution and the war in Bosnia and then afterwards Kosovo were absolutely dramatic events, at least for me, and I think for many people they were. For some people they were not, actually. Some people were, how should I say, so that as wars of independence, particularly I think that was the case in Kosovo. But for others it was a traumatic event, and it is also true that for many people, I know quite a few people from Serbia and Croatia who went to Canada. It was really a desire to escape and to basically leave Europe and the Balkans forever and not to have any contacts with them anymore.
Do you still in some ways think of yourself as a Yugoslav?
I do, but I have to say that it is actually to some extent irrelevant, because I was joking with somebody who was actually still using Yugoslav as a name, and I said, well, you can call yourself Byzantine, because, you know, the empires, some empires have disappeared. There is no really reason to actually speak of yourself as being part of something which no longer exists.
You're an economic historian, Branko. Your last book is on the history of inequality. How does America appear in, well, let's begin more broadly in economic terms. Some people see America as being different in the history of economics, of being a new start, a new beginning. How does America appear in easy question for you, in the narrative of economic history?
It's actually a very complicated question. You know, America appears in many different facets. Let me try to kind of summarize it. And there was really a pioneering book by Peter Lindert and Jeff Williamson that looked at inequality in the United States from 1774, just before the independence. And the difficulty of America is that it starts by being ostensibly, and it was actually, a fairly egalitarian society among the people who came from Europe, who were white and who actually owned land. At the same time, you have slavery. So really, the situation already becomes more complex because of slavery. That goes on, as we know, until 1865. Inequality really probably peaked in the United States in the 1920s. So there was a continued increase of inequality linked also with large immigration flows from Europe, which kept the wage rates relatively low. And then you have a period of extraordinary decline of what is called the Great Compression, and that's where Simon Kuznets, who is one of the heroes in my book, come in. Because when Simon Kuznets writes in the 1950s his really seminal articles and books, he is facing first the fact the United States is by far the strongest country in the world, producing 40% of GDP of the world. Secondly, it's a country that won the war, is strongest militarily, as I said, economically, and at the same time, it is a country with decreasing inequality. So he actually has in front of him an extremely rosy picture of the United States and its role in the world. And it does show in his writings, because he did believe that this would continue, that actually inequality would be on a secular decline, and that was also the part of American history. Of course, the reality then was that with Reagan, as we all know, inequality went up. So it is a long story. It cannot be really very easily summarized in only a few words.
I want to get to Reagan and neoliberalism, Branko, one of your areas of expertise. But what about slavery, the original sin of the American Republic? How did this contribute to economic inequality, obviously bound up in cultural and political inequality? But in your analysis, how did the institution of slavery up until the Civil War shape not just American economics, but American economic inequality? Not just between whites and blacks, but between whites and whites.
Overall, I'm using here really Lindart's and Williamson's book. They're using they're using social tables to derive the distribution at different intervals. So I think it was 1840, 1850, 1860, 1870, so forth. And essentially, slavery contributes to inequality by increasing the gap between the rich whites and the middle class whites and the poor whites. Now, the slaves themselves, and that's the interesting part of the book, and I'm just quoting them, so one should not take this as a political statement. The slaves, with having no social political rights, their still level of income, of subsistence, was not that different, actually some people even say higher, than the poorest people in England or parts of Western Europe. So we are basically speaking of the bottom, that is at subsistence, whether they would be living in Glasgow or they would be living in Toulouse or Milan or in Russia, or being enslaved. Now, of course, the issue with slavery is the lack of obviously any rights, and in that sense it was similar to Russian serfdom, which likewise was really basically control of one person by another. But when you look at simply at the subsistence, their consumption level is at the subsistence levels, and it was not that different, as I was saying, from people in Europe or in China for that matter.
From what I can remember, and Branko, you know a lot more about this than I do, this was Marx's position in the Communist Manifesto. If that's right, then does that make the capitalist economy of the 19th century, the American or West European economy, relatively similar to the slave economy?
As you know, it is really now a huge topic of discussion, the contribution of slavery first to the Industrial Revolution, to accumulation of capital, and also to the formation of the capitalist world system. I do think that there are very strong roles that slavery had. Now, one should not forget, this was not the only time in history of the world that we had slavery. Actually, we had slavery throughout history. And Adam Smith, whom I actually quote also in Visions of Inequality, actually have a whole chapter on Smith. Adam Smith is interesting because he believed that slavery would never be abolished. He abhorred slavery. He thought it was inefficient as a mode of production. But why did he think that it would not be abolished? And it was, he said, by pure luck that it got abolished in a corner of Europe where he lived. The reason is the following. Because slaveholders, he thought rightly, have political power. Elimination of slavery meant basically taking assets from them, and they would never agree to that. So that was his position. He deplored the fact that actually slavery would exist, it would remain, but he thought it would be impossible to eradicate.
What was the impact of slavery on poor, free whites? We know the political impact. We still may be seeing that in the history of contemporary populism. But did slavery make poor free whites, richer or poorer? Is that the wrong way of thinking about it?
You know, I'm not sure really that I can answer it exactly. So far as I remember from as I was mentioning before, the social tables, of course, their income levels of the poor whites was not much different from the income levels of slaves. Actually, you know, counting income level of slave is a very tricky thing. We do it as a number, but you know, if you do not have any other, not only rights, but if you're subject to somebody's totally arbitrary power, the number of calories that you take is really a very bad indication of your economic status. I mean, we could then likewise do the concentration camp inequality, you know, so long as people were not...
I shouldn't be laughing, but...
You know, that's the issue. So I don't know exactly, but I think possibly such cheap labor must have had, I suppose, some dampening effect on poor whites' wages as well. But as I said, it is really something that I simply I'm not sure that you know, that I remember well from Lindert and Williamson.
Branko, what does an economist, particularly a progressive economist like yourself, make of the almost absurd contradiction between the political language of this new republic and the talk of equality for everyone and the centrality in economic and cultural terms of slavery in the early history of America?
You know, for me it was, when I started actually reading a little bit more American history, that was really a big issue. And essentially, I think, I'm not a political scientist, but essentially you have at the very beginning a sort of a slave-owning oligarchy that claims to be a democracy, and there is really a problem, because when you read all the, you know, things of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and all of that, there is non-existence. Slavery, of course, was not as big then as it became later, but then, of course, there is also indigenous population, but they don't appear in this picture. And going back to what we were saying before, again, it's a very controversial topic, but it's similar. Let's suppose, can you really study the Soviet Union's inequality in the 1950s and forget about people in the Gulag? You know, you can just say, okay, they don't count, but in reality they do count. There are people. There were, I think, about 3 million people. So I think our interpretations generally tend to really be driven by the sort of the narrative that is produced by those in power, and we tend to forget everybody else.
I think you're the first person I've heard, at least on this show, to explicitly compare the Soviet Gulag and the American system of slavery.
Well, yes, they were quite similar. You can actually say there are certain advantages of the one from the other, because the Gulag eventually, many people in 1953, when Khrushchev declared amnesty, they got out of the Gulag, and for the end of the slavery, you had to wait until the end of the Civil War to get out of it, and maybe for many of them it took much longer to get out of slavery.
I wonder if the Soviets had built their gulags on race, Americans would have been quite as offended. That's another question. What about the end of slavery, Branko, in the middle of the 19th century? What was its impact, not just on the American economy, but on inequality in this country?
You know, inequality actually then, as I was saying before, did increase in the US in the latter part of the 19th century, but it was really not the result of the end of slavery. It was the result of huge economic dynamism of the United States and huge inflow of cheap labor from Europe, especially, but also from China. But you know, I'm glad that you mentioned, well, we have talked quite a lot about slavery. Many people forget how frequent forced labor was. If you look Central Europe, corvée, or forced labor, was abolished in the 1848 revolution in Austria-Hungary and Central Europe. In France, it was abolished before with the French Revolution. In Russia, it lasted until 1861 with the abolition of serfdom. US 1865, Brazil 1878. China and India still have indentured labor. So really, basically, you have to really wait until the end of the 19th century to sort of have the end of the systemic slavery. And of course we continued still with slavery afterwards, we still have it today, but you cannot say it's a systemic slavery. But we have to realize how prevalent it was until relatively recently, how prevalent that mode of production was until 150 years ago.
Maybe I'm rephrasing the question in an odd way, Branko, but how did the failure of Reconstruction and the re-engineering or the reactionary engineering of America into Jim Crow America, kind of one that in some ways was like the old slave system, how did that impact inequality? Is there a counter-narrative? Had Reconstruction worked? Had American blacks become genuinely free in political terms? Might the country be more or less equal?
Well, I would say that it is. I am not aware actually of really empirical counterfactuals. The obvious answer would be that essentially yes, it would be more equal, but I think what would be most important, what would be the most important difference is intergenerational mobility. I think the issue which we still face now in the United States, and you can see that in all these studies about intergenerational mobility, is really the long shadow of slavery. And that while it may not have as much maybe impact necessarily that you can measure on wage or wage inequality, although they still exist, as you know, everything else being the same, of course, African Americans still receive lower wage. But the impact on intergenerational mobility, I think, is very high, in the sense that you do not have the same opportunities, or you do not even know how to use the opportunities because of your position or historical, how should I say, historical injustice and historically inferior position that you were in.
Rather than the long tail, perhaps you should call your next book The Long Shadow. As America became the engine, again, if that's the right word, it's probably a word that Marx would have chosen, of this new global industrial world economy before the First World War, to what extent were inequalities in America, especially given this massive immigrant class coming in mostly from South and Central and Eastern Europe, how much more unequal was America in the 20 years before the 30 or 40 years before the First World War than industrializing European states?
You know, this is an interesting question, because America, compared, for example, to Britain, had a lower wealth inequality before World War I. British wealth inequality was extraordinarily high. If I remember correctly, 10% of the population had 70% of wealth. And it was really huge wealth inequality. America, being a newer society, did not have enough time as Britain to accumulate that wealth and to actually put it in a few hands. That changed after World War I, and I think people, of course, argue whether 1928-29 was the peak of U.S. inequality, although some also say that it could have been, we don't really have good data for that. Some said it could be 1933 because unemployment itself increased inequality. So essentially we're talking about significant increases then, but the US inequality was not out of range with comparable European inequalities at that time. I think that the US becomes more unequal compared to West European countries only from the 1970s basically, or 80s, not before then.
We're going to get there, Branko, in a second. But speaking of this period, the traditional progressive narrative is that the trust busters changed everything, that big industry and the railroads, oil became too powerful, they were the drivers of inequality. and then the American state addressed that through trust busting. Is that a fair narrative, and did that counter some of the economic inequalities of this early industrial age?
You know, I know the narrative. It seems to me that the narrative makes quite a lot of sense. Whether that narrative is corroborated by numbers, I'm not quite sure. And the issue is also, where would you get these numbers? You know, the numbers from the 1920s are really very fragmentary. But you know, the narrative does make sense. It is actually the narrative that you can, to some extent, see even today, as you have very fast technological progress and huge expansion to new areas of production. You just tend to have, as Schumpeter used to write, you have monopolies. Whether, and his argument was, whether it is a monopoly that is more efficient in creating new technology, or whether the technology itself creates a monopoly, doesn't make any difference. There is a sort of monopoly that appears on the scene, as we have now today with Google, with Microsoft, with Amazon, and so forth. And it does tend to generate greater inequality than otherwise. And in order for you to stop that increase, you have to try to demonopolize them, or to actually go and trust bust.
Branko, you were educated in theories of dialectical materialism, these ideas of the inevitability of history. You're far too sophisticated a thinker, I think, to have fallen for that one. But was there, in some ways, a degree of inevitability about the stock market insanity of the 20s in America, the consequential crash, and then the appearance of the New Deal?
Well, it seems obviously, with hindsight, it's always, everything seems inevitable, that it could not have happened the other way. But yes, the 1920s were, of course, a very interesting period through, actually, first, the increase of inequality, then for the first time, a global role of the United States also. You know, as we all know, in 1918, when Woodrow Wilson came to Europe, he was actually seen as the savior. He came not only as a most powerful nation, because basically American intervention in the war made the difference, but also with the program. And at the same time, domestically, there was, of course, an increase in inequality. I just watched the other day, which I would very highly recommend, the Great Gatsby musical. Of course, I'm a huge fan of Scott Fitzgerald and of the book, and the musical follows really the book almost to the letter. And it does actually give you this picture of excess of the 1920s, on an attempt of somebody who comes from a relatively modest milieu to make it to the top, and the failure to make it to the top, which actually was the key part, I think, of the book, is that actually people who were already at the top would make everything they can to stop your rise. Great Gatsby's rise, actually.
We could do a whole show on Gatsby.
Yes,
Branko, we have to move on. How profound was the New Deal? Again, progressives, particularly nostalgic progressives, and I think most American progressives tend to be a little bit nostalgic, look back at the New Deal as the defining moment in 20th century American history, particularly in the way in which it redistributed wealth, addressed inequalities, addressed the unregulated power of corporations. In terms of the history of inequality, how different was the America of 1930 from the America of 1945?
I'm not sure about 1945, but
post-New Deal.
I think it was a big change. You know, I was again referring to something that I read recently. It was Gary Gartler's book on the rise and fall and of the neoliberal order, which is basically only about.
Gary's been on the show a couple of times.
Well, excellent book, really excellent book. And of course, the argument there is that this became an order, by which Gary means that it was accepted also by those who originally rejected it, and he uses Eisenhower's in 1952 decision to continue with basically New Deal policies as indication that it has been accepted even by the Republicans who originally, as you know, were of course against it. So it was a big change in many respects. I also reread recently, for example, just let me give another example, James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution. And there he has many interesting points in the book, but one of the things that he mentions is that during the presidential campaigns, Roosevelt never used the words such as employer, capitalist, and owner. So he actually tried to avoid using these words because they were charged and they were no longer considered in the era of depression, high unemployment as good words. So you would start using words like managers and things like that, but not really capitalists. And that was, of course, a terminological change, but there was, of course, much more, as you know, all the agencies that were created, public works, social security, unemployment benefits. These are really major changes in the United States.
In historical terms, then, would it be fair to argue that America remained New Deal through certainly the great society reforms of Johnson in the 60s right up until Reagan, that the period between 1930, the mid-30s and maybe even the late 70s was one fairly coherent, cogent economic narrative in America?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Before I answer that, let me just mention that one thing which is very noticeable, whoever works with income inequality data, is that you see several changes, in particular, the change in income inequality measured annually, the change in social mobility, both taking place at the late 70s and early 80s. So you basically see increased inequality and declining social mobility with Reaganomics. And it's very interesting that you cannot avoid not seeing that there was some turning point which happened between, let's say, it was 1979 and 1983. And that was the beginning, in Gary's book, actually, it's the beginning of the second order, a second political order, and that was a political order of neoliberalism, which actually became a real order with Clinton adopting the Reaganomics, or the policies which are associated with Reagan. So there is, I think, very little doubt that these years around 1980 were the years of big change.
The 50s, of course, was a period of remarkable economic expansion, suburbanization, revolution of consumer capitalism of one kind or another. How did that impact equality or inequality? Did everyone become richer? Did wealthy people become wealthier faster than working class people? I mean, obviously, up until the 1960s, I'm guessing there were still pretty radical divisions between whites and blacks.
These divisions were there, but I think what we still have in mind as a sort of quintessential American middle class is that picture of the 1950s and the 1960s of, families with, I don't know, several kids living in suburban homes.
It's the Levittown image.
Yes, it is. This is still the image, and I think that consumer-oriented and actually able to consume a lot, middle class was indeed created in those years. America was, as I was saying before, in relationship to Kuznets's work, was really at a very unique position in its own and world history. So when some people, actually that's an interesting also topic, when some people talk now, I'm not using slogan of Trump, but maybe people use like that America should regain its position. They're using really, if they think of the 1950s, they're using a yardstick which is not possible to attain again. You would not have, America producing 40% of world GDP anytime, probably in history from then until maybe another 2 centuries, whatever, that is not going to come back. And so that was a very unique period where, as you know, Europe was devastated, China was in a civil war, India was poor and still a colony. That's not going to come back, and these countries are big and they would have a much bigger role in the world. So that was the America of the 1950s. It was a dream. It was a dream when actually the gaps between the blacks and whites were huge, but it was a dream for the American middle class in the global context, but that's not going to come back.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering that, of course, Levittown, which was this supposed dream of suburban America, was a place that I don't think sold its homes to African Americans, so there was a strong element of race there too. You mentioned this growth of America. I think it's an astonishing fact, but before the Second World War, the American standing army was about the size of Sweden or Portugal. America was not a global military power. The period after the Second World War resulted in America becoming this global military power, the appearance of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. How important was that, Branko, in your visions of equality, or the reality of equality? Did it require massive investments in military technology, both for American armament and arms overseas, and of course eventually foreign wars?
This is such a difficult topic because from the economic point of view, we do include in GDP, in national accounts, we include military production. So there is no difference whether you actually build a spaceship or, missile to destroy, to kill people and destroy things, and you build a restaurant to feed people. And that's the problem of accounting, but accounting being what it is, certainly that the military production, we know from the numbers, was about, expenditures on the military were about 5% of GDP. These are sizable numbers. They also the argument is made that actually contributed even to technological advance in some areas. As you know, the system of the federally built roads was also based to some extent on national security considerations. In the case of a war, the argument was that you would actually be able to evacuate cities much better if you have good roads. And that same issue appeared very recently with Putin's war in Ukraine and the fact that Russian economy is growing at 3% per year with increased military spending. So you have exactly the same point, like should you really count military spending as part of the GDP? It's really very, how should I say, I'm not saying it's counterintuitive, but it's we do tend to resist that on some moral grounds, but the fact is that it is part of GDP. It is what is called the military Keynesianism, and that military Keynesianism did play a role in the US.
As I said earlier, Branko, you're politically on the left, but I wonder whether, in your view, wearing your economics cap, you have any respect for the Chicago School, for Friedman's reading of Hayek, and for this radical rethinking of Keynesianism, if that's the right way of putting it, that began maybe even in the 50s and 60s. First of all, these people were considered crazy, and then they began to reshape the world. Did they have a point? Had Keynesianism become this economic bureaucracy which stood against innovation?
Could be. Let me just break this question into two parts. First, about Friedman. I actually do believe that Friedman was probably the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, maybe together with Hayek. And I think that actually he simplified Hayek, I think, in many ways. I think Hayek is a more profound thinker, and as you know, he has, of course, philosophical writings. He has writings things in, legal history, jurisprudence, and so on. But one thing that I really dislike about the Chicago School, and actually that's also part of my Visions of Inequality book, is their misinterpretation of Adam Smith. I think it's a willful misinterpretation, because Smith was very critical of the ways that capitalists, or what he called in those days masters, have acquired wealth. He was extremely critical about trading companies. He was very attuned and sort of scathing about plunder, slavery that I mentioned before, and also he thought that there was a role for government, and all of that was essentially taken out of Smith. And what the Chicago School did actually small pieces that were consistent with their own thinking, and essentially they hijacked Adam Smith. There is a nice book by Amity Liu, who actually writes about the essentially reinterpretation or willful misinterpretation of Adam Smith by the Chicago School. So that was my answer about Chicago.
So you're saying that they willfully misrepresented Adam Smith, but is that either here nor there? What about whether they had a point in their critique?
No, but let me, Andrew, I think it is important that willful misinterpretation is important, because Adam Smith is self-foundational to economic science. So if you really take him and sort of present him as a purely sort of unilateral thinker, and pull out really the quotations that you like, you're basically reshaping economics, and that's what they did. Now, generally speaking, yes, were they successful? They were successful. After all, Reaganomics was, to some extent, supported by, well, to a large extent actually, invented and supported by them, and that particular mode of thinking is still very influential in economics. So I see it as influential, but when it comes to income distribution and all these things that I work with, their influence was purely, how should I say, I'm not saying disastrous, but negative, certainly, when it comes to that. They might have had maybe better influence on monetary policy or control of inflation or whatever that I cannot discuss, but when it comes to studies of income distribution, awareness of that, their influence was disastrous.
Branko, how do we define Reaganism? For me as a non-economist, I think of two things. Reduction of taxes, right, and reduction of public expenditure. Is that too simplistic?
Well, it's always more complicated than 2 or 3 sentences, but basically that's the idea. He did reduce taxes. He didn't actually reduce public expenditures, because he made budget deficits even larger than before. But it was deregulation, which was important. Deregulation, discrimination between labor incomes and capital incomes in favor of capital incomes, treatment of capitalists as valuable sort of creators of value and of jobs. That was an ideological thing. So they're actually more valuable than somebody else who is just receiving a job, because a capitalist has to give somebody a job, has to accumulate money, has to invest, and so on. And of course, reduction of taxation. That was a big deal of Reaganomics, and that's why actually the deficits probably went up.
What about the conservative argument, the Chicago School argument, that ultimately everybody benefited from this because it offered entrepreneurs, innovators an opportunity? With high taxes, there aren't incentives. Is there any truth to that argument?
It's an endless argument. Certainly, if the tax rate if you were to take everything that everybody sort of has earned and give it to somebody else, it's going to have a disincentive effect. On the other hand, look at the alternative of actually not having any taxation, to have a totally free capitalism without any government transfer. That was, of course, never existed in history. But let's suppose you would also have a society that would collapse, as Polanyi was saying. It's basically the society would defend itself against that. So clearly we're somewhere in between. Now, whether the tax rate, which is now, the maximum tax rate, the marginal tax rate, which is almost 40%, is really something that we cannot go above, I'm not quite sure. And actually, one part that I think is wrong is that distinction, which actually came with Reagan, between lower taxation for capital incomes than labor incomes. And that's the case that we still have it, and it is considered almost sort of not only acceptable but almost paradigmically okay, simply because in one case you actually tax less income which presumably should be invested. But mind you, you're taxing it less because you expect that it should be invested, but you totally disregard the origin of that income. One case, income is result of labor, which means actually exertion of labor power every day, and the other case, it is really oftentimes simply used income that is received by you giving your money to somebody else to manage, and you're doing nothing.
Branko, taking your economics cap off for a moment, how has America changed in the years since Reagan? You've lived here.
Yes, I lived through this whole thing. Well, it's really difficult to say. The United States is such a complicated society, and it's so multifarious, that you have really to basically focus on one thing and say it has changed this way or that way. I think socially America has changed significantly for the better, and I think it's partly results even of the 1968 revolution. And I think there is less. There was always less of the sort of class consciousness in the U.S. than in Europe. On the other hand, I think that the Reagan Revolution, neo-liberal revolution, has created an elite, an upper class that believes in some sense to be deserving of that position. It was Daniel Markovich's book on meritocracy, and there is a very strong element, also Michael Sandel, a very strong...
Both of whom, not to...
Well, in your show,
on too much, but Markovic and Sandel have both been on the show.
Well, they're really excellent, and really what I think is important there is not only that this meritocracy, so-called meritocracy, has been created, it's also the intimate belief that the class has that it deserves to be there. And I think that's the issue, and in that sense, ideologically, neoliberalism supported that belief. And that class, as actually documented in it's my forthcoming book, but also I published that class is now, if you take the top 10%, they are also in the top 10% capital owners and top 10% of wage earners. So that class is almost impregnable now. They have high capital incomes, they have high labor incomes, they transmit advantages to their children, and they believe that they are the best. So that, I think, is somewhat problematic.
To put it mildly, a euphemism somewhat problematic, Branko. Does this new class, this 10%, I'm happy you talk about the 10% rather than the 1%.
Yeah.
Richard Reeves has written extensively on this 10 and 20% too. Do they suffer from what the old left used to call false consciousness about their own role in history?
Well, let me just go first about the numbers. I looked empirically, as I was saying. So you have 10%, you take 10% of the richest Americans, and you say, okay, what share of this 10% are also in top 10% by labor and by capital income? It turns out it's actually 30% of them. So this is, in my opinion, really the core of the ruling class or the elite. It's about 3% of Americans who are actually that group. Now that group, as I was saying before, I'm not sure that they suffer for false consciousness. I think that they, false consciousness requires a judgment from the spectator, from me, to say that actually they are believing something which is not true. But they themselves believe that this position is well deserved. And I think that neoliberal ideology that identifies really human success with accumulation of wealth supports them, because they see empirically that they have this wealth. That wealth has to be made, and if you make this wealth, that means that you're actually a person with superior ability, skill, intelligence, whatever. And this is what they believe. And it's hard to kind of say that they are suffering from false consciousness.
But this is not just a conservative consciousness. The progressive elites in where you live in New York, where we're talking,
right,
I live in California, my sense is they're probably on the political front more progressive than conservative. They bought into this. They're the helicopter parents. They're the ones who invest so much in their kids going to the top schools and universities and law schools and medical schools. So in a sense, we talked, I think, earlier about de Tocqueville. Hasn't America become a feudal society?
Well, I think that entrenched, so far entrenched, we don't know how long it would last, but that particular elite, in my opinion, is really ironically a danger. I'm not going to use big words, but a danger to social mobility and even democracy, because we didn't mention it, but they also are the major funders of political campaigns. They are the major influencers, because they are the ones who consume the news, who produce the news, who influence. And then that elite, by being so strong politically, economically, and ideologically, really does become, I think, in the medium term, a threat to the other values that Americans, in theory at least, always held. So, it's not going to be a monarchy. I mean, going back to the famous, sort of saying that we gave you a republic, but it would be an oligarchic, and it is actually an oligarchic republic.
We often hear of the numbers. Are there one or two data points, Branko, that really capture how dramatic inequality has been compounded in America since the neoliberal revolution?
Well, the numbers actually, like you take the most general number, which doesn't mean too much to people, but you take the Gini coefficient, and just to give you an idea, you have it in, let's suppose, social democratic European states and in Central European countries, you have that number to be about 27, 28, always below 30. Well, that number in the United States in 1980 was about 33. Well, that number now is 43. So there was a significant increase.
What does that mean?
Well, that means for normal people, that means that basically with the number 43, you're about, you're not as unequal as Brazil, which is over the 50, but you're significantly more unequal than countries which are not small countries, but countries like Germany and France and the UK. So that is and when you break up U.S. inequality by all different ways that you can do it, by wage, by capital income, by gender, by parental relationship, by household types and all that, you always find a higher inequality than in relatively comparable countries, as I said, like France or the UK or Germany. I'm not using small countries that are maybe much more homogeneous, like, certainly Austria or Hungary or others, but even large countries, you find higher inequality here.
Where are people most sensitive about inequality? In the upcoming election, one gets the sense that on the real estate front, people are particularly sensitive, and the demographic implications, it's harder and harder for young people to own property and climb up the economic ladder. There's also the issue, of course, of gender, although that seems to be reflected more in people's positions on abortion than on economics. Are the divisions in American society, particularly when it comes to politics, on age and on gender, perhaps even on sexuality, do they play themselves out in the debate on inequality?
The inequality, I always say it, actually, it's very difficult when you speak of inequality because it's a very amorphous topic. I say, I'm unhappy about inequality. It's not something that is really tangible. But where it is tangible, let me give you two examples where I think then influence people's political opinions so where you can see things. The first one, if you look at the growth rate along the U.S. income distribution, and you pick any year after 1980, and you compare with any year recently, whether you want to do it before COVID or after COVID, whatever you want. And what you find out is that for up to about 90 to 90% of the population, you had an average rate of growth of about 1% per year. And you find for the top 5% or so, or 7, depending on the years, you find a rate of growth which was 3 times as large. So that's a fundamental issue, is that actually for 90% of Americans, the mean, what we call as the mean growth rate, really, their rate of growth was 1% per year. So when they compare that with those who are already richer to start with and who grew at 3%, that's the problem. Second issue is one that you alluded to, and it's the increase in prices of relative prices of 3 important parts of consumption. This is education, health, housing, and more recently retail prices. But I leave retail prices for time being out because it's a more recent phenomenon. But when you look at housing, education, and health, that has gone up in price tremendously, and it squeezes people's budget, and these are non-discretionary things. You know, housing, obviously you can live in a better or worse housing, but it is something that you have to have. Health is something also which is almost non-discretionary, and education is your prerequisite, or for your children prerequisite, to make it somewhere. So the relative prices of all 3 have gone up, and I think that's how people perceive it, and that's why many of them are unhappy.
Branko, you referred to Gary Gerstle. He's been on the show several times. His book, The Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism, or the Neoliberal Order, has been very influential. Do you agree with him that we're at the end of this historical epoch, if that's the right word, of neoliberalism?
Yeah, I do agree. I think actually I do agree, and I think we have already moved with the first Trump presidency and even with Biden presidency, which has actually inherited and continued with many of the things that Trump did. I think we have already moved there, and I think we have moved there even, I know this will be very controversial, but even regardless of whoever wins the election, I think that some elements which are in direct, how should I say, opposition to that neoliberal order have already been included here, and these are of course trade wars, economic coercion, anti-immigration policies, and these things are not going to change regardless of who comes to power. And so that's why I think that I agree with the claim that Gary makes, that we are at the end of the neoliberal order.
What was the impact of the Trump presidency on inequality in America?
Well, this is really kind of a bizarre, because of course Trump reduced tax rates, and we know that actually reduction, especially of the highest tax rates which he did, would add to inequality. But ironically, the last year of his presidency was the year of large COVID support. You know, we are talking about CARES Act, which had I think 12% of GDP. And the distribution of that, if you look at that, was really across the board up to something like 70th percentile of the US population. Actually, if you're below the 70th percentile, grosso modo, you could actually get some support. Now, what it did have as an impact is the reduction of inequality in that 1 year. 2020 is actually significant reduction of US observed inequality. Now, the year after that, of course, we go back to the usual trend. But ironically, his last year was the year of reduced inequality because of the Congress, basically. But he might get some credit because he was president.
Do you buy the progressive critique of Trump and of the Republican Party that their real interest is simply making the rich richer and benefiting the billionaire Trump class?
That's a very difficult question, because Trump has many sort of contradictory positions. On the one hand, yes, that's true, and he basically sees economics as a sort of what I call businessman's economics. It's basically you're fighting, you see mercantilism as a normal thing internationally, and domestically you see monopolies as a normal thing, and you just fight over the turf. But on the other hand, he does have certain policies, and that's where actually the trade trade war with China came from, attempting to placate or to improve the position of traditional middle class in the United States. So he is a complex amalgam of these different policies. I think it's more complex than Reagan in many ways, and it's also less intellectually clear, not only because Trump himself is not clear about what he wants to do, but I don't think he has an intellectual background, other people, which prepared Reagan. It's much more, I think, fluid and less intellectual than Reagan's counter-revolution.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison, Reagan and Trump. Reagan was clearly influenced by the Chicago School, by Friedman, by these radical, what seem to be radical economists, these iconoclastic economists. Trump isn't, he's a reactionary economist.
But also they were actually building that sort of intellectual climate, and actually Gary's book also mentions that, and many other people who write about that period, they were building that intellectual climate prior to Reagan's assumption of power or coming to presidency. And I just don't see, or maybe I'm wrong on that, but I just don't see a similar intellectual build-up now. So Trump is improvising not only because he himself has to improvise, because I think there is no intellectually sufficient background, economic background from which he can draw.
Nothing is ever really accidental in history, Branko, you know that. So we're at the end of this period of neoliberalism, but the question is what comes next?
Yeah.
Gary Gerstle does a very good job explaining the end. I think he does, it's very hard to see into the future. He does a less convincing job figuring out what's next. There seems to be two ways of thinking of what comes after neoliberalism. The first is what will, the second is what should. Let's deal with the should first. Progressives often point to places like Denmark, which sometimes I think they see as Scandinavian versions of the New Deal and the Great Society. Are there alternative economic models out there that America could say, we want to be like Denmark, we want to be like Sweden or Germany or Singapore or Taiwan, or is that delusionary?
Yeah, I will not answer you fully that question, because this is something that I'm actually writing about now. My next book is going to be on that. It's going to be a relatively short book, and it will deal with what next. It's a very, of course, very difficult question. I will not reveal it now what I think. I don't think
that because you haven't figured it out yet, or you don't
actually by now, we had this interview about a month ago. One could say that I haven't figured it out, but I think now I have at least figured it out for myself. Doesn't mean it would happen, but at least
so you figured out what will rather than should.
What will, yes. What should, I think, is really a question that honestly I'm not particularly interested, and I think it's lots of wishful thinking. And the US is not going to become Denmark, it's not going to become Singapore. US would be not only because of its size, but because of its history, because of its position in the world and all of that. US will dictate what, not necessarily in a negative manner, but simply because the events here are disproportionately important. It would dictate what others would do. And it did, actually, when you look with Reagan revolution or counter-revolution, it did provoke the revolutions elsewhere. Of course, it was Thatcher and Reagan, but it was really these two countries that changed totally the atmospherics in the world. Likewise, I don't think that actually Denmark is going to change the atmospherics in the US. It's rather the other way around.
Branko, 2026, America will be celebrating its 250th year anniversary. Will you be celebrating?
Yes, yes, I will. Actually, I'm sure there will be fireworks in New York. So, I will be hopefully.
Well, it's one thing to enjoy the fireworks, but will your heart be with those fireworks?
Yes, it was, of course, America is a big, and to some extent a huge experiment, which has all the complicated features of the experiment that became the greatest, and its effect, the greatest power or the greatest empire in the history of the world. So it's not a small thing, and actually it's probably certainly the only global empire that the world has ever seen. Romans didn't know about the rest of the world. So yes, it's big.
You seem a little resigned on that. And finally, Branko, a lot of people are very pessimistic about the future of America. Is it Rome? Even Francis Ford Coppola has a new movie out imagining the future of America to be that of Rome. Can America survive the 21st century without addressing the radical inequality in the country?
No, I think that the U.S. will have to address the radical inequality, and it will have to address this issue of the elite, of the class that is essentially impervious to a change in stock market or change in the employment policies or anything. It will have to address that. But the comparison between the U.S., the Mercury of America, and Rome, as you know, it's a very old one. But we should not forget that these things take a very long time. People's thinking is very compressed. But if you just take the Western Roman Empire, the end was in the I think 450 of the Western, which actually was no longer even the central part of the empire because the capital was already in Constantinople. So we are not talking about the processes that happen that take 20 years. We're talking about processes that take centuries. And America is still a relatively young country. As you mentioned, it will be only 250 years. It can go for another 250.
No, Branko Milanovic, not just America is a young country, you're a young economist coming out with a new book in the next year or two, which will fix all the problems of inequality. We'll have to get you back on the show. But as always, a real pleasure and honor. Branko Milanovic, thank you so much for appearing on Keen on America.
Well, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Tough questions as always, but pleasure to be able to answer them, in part at least.